Welcome back to AP European History, Unit 6, Industrialization, and etc. Today's topic, challenges to the new system. We've talked about the rise of this new industrialization and urbanization and some of the labor pushbacks against industrialization. Today we're going to get into some of the isms that both defend and push back against this new system, the rise of the new wealthy, including people like the Chartists and socialism. So first we have to start with the conservatism that comes out of the ruins of the French Revolution and the English Civil War. Both of those deeply chaotic times for their respective nations, for the English and their civil war after they overthrew Charles I, and the French after they overthrew their king and had a multiple series of miniature revolutions in the midst of that. There was a deep fear amongst many people that change is deeply dangerous. Change can cause death, chaos, economic destruction, wars. We think about the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars and the upending of the Ancien regime. Change is dangerous. So a new political movement was needed coming into the 1800s. And historians generally call that conservatism, the idea of conserving the status quo, protecting the status quo. So in particular, what are elements of this type of conservatism? We're primarily looking at first tradition, that conservatives believe that those in the past, and a lot of this comes from Edmund Burke, who you see over to the right, ideas that tradition is not formed by scientists deciding here is what we must force upon people, because they tried that in the French Revolution and that had failed, but instead it comes from the people experimenting with things over years and coming up with traditions that seem to work. So even though we may not rationally understand why we have certain traditions, those traditions have been passed down to us because they were useful in the past, and maybe we shouldn't be too quick to overthrow tradition just because we think we're smarter than our ancestors. All right, so tradition is very important. They will try to protect tradition. Second, big believers in the monarchy, that they saw monarchies as a stable form of government, that when they'd ever had periods of chaos, like the English Civil War, the French Revolution, it's because monarchies had been upended. And but when you have a good stable monarchy, which will eventually be the case in places like Prussia and England, then you will have long-term internal stability. And that stability is good for everybody. It's not just good for the wealthy. Third, aristocracy. Big believers in hierarchy and that there should be an elite class of people who are probably highly educated and have money and should be encouraged to spend their time in defending and preserving their society and their nation. So nobles they saw again as those who had a deep stake in stability and a deep stake in protecting the nation. So aristocrats should be our leaders. And fourth, and finally, established churches. Now, established churches, that doesn't mean churches that have been around for a while. That means the official state churches. So in England, the Church of England. In France, the Catholic Church. In Prussia, Lutheran Church. So you're looking at what are the official state churches, that those were also seen as sources of conservatism, of forces that can protect us from dangerous changes because they are so well connected to the past and tradition, and they have influence over the people. So also to the right, you have Boris Johnson, the new Tory Prime Minister of England. Tories are the Conservative Party in England. And you can see that conservatives have not really changed their poor hairstyles over the years. But when you think about why it was conservatives that led the push through Brexit, you think about the preservation of tradition. That for them, for many of them, the danger of becoming part of Europe is you lose your English identity, you lose English traditions, you lose what the past had passed on to you. So conservatives are interested oftentimes in this type of localism or this version of nationalism. All right. So that's the group that all these other groups are going to be fighting against, the conservatives. And the conservatives, again, they're this weird amalgam of religious leaders and aristocrats and monarchs, and they don't always get along, but they know they're kind of scared of everyone else. And the biggest group they're going to end up scared of are artisans. Artisans, remember, are the skilled workers of the Industrial Revolution, those who were very close to being wealthy. If they just could make a few more steps, they could move up from the working class to the middle class. So why do they become a radical class, and why do they become the leaders of those pushing back? In part because the Industrial Revolution, in many cases, artisans made out pretty well that they had discovered a new wealth, as had many people, but they had no political power. And with that growth of wealth, they demanded political power. Why do we have a workshop? Why do I employ 20 people, but I can't vote? And there was also a fear of missing out because wealthy capitalists, the bourgeois class, were buying up entire factories. And that was also kind of a threat to their way of life. So in England, we'll see kind of this first movement of this group called Chartism. It was officially called the London Working Men's Association, founded around 1836. It's called Chartism because in 1838, they published a charter. And in that charter, there were a number of things that will eventually become law. But it's kind of their list of, hey, we want these things to happen because these can push us forward. These can push us into political power and not just economic success. For example, they wanted universal manhood suffrage. They felt that, one, it was a way for the poor and the working class to protect themselves, but it was also a reflection of the changing times, that the working class was wealthier, was more influential in the economy. They just weren't a bunch of poor farmers. Now they were workers in cities. Second, a secret ballot. Up to this point, England was still using a very public balloting system, which meant your local lord or the local strongman had quite a bit of influence over how you voted because you didn't want him to see you voting for the wrong person. It could impact your future. Annual elections to Parliament. Instead of having elections to Parliament at the whim of the monarch, why not have those annually so they can be more receptive to what the people want? Fourth, they wanted to equalize electoral districts. England had given out had defined electoral districts, like who gets to vote to people to Parliament, based upon medieval tradition. So, for example, a town that was really important in 1400 would be given the right to elect someone to Parliament. That was in 1400. Now it's 1840. That town still has 200 people in it, but Manchester has tens of thousands. They don't have that right to vote because Manchester never got that right to elect someone to Parliament. So how is that fair that all these working people get no one in Parliament, but this little town, which is probably controlled by a powerful aristocrat, they choose someone to Parliament, but Manchester doesn't? So they wanted to equalize that. So again, the influence of the working classes, growing working class, could be felt in the political system. And finally, they wanted to get rid of the property requirements to be in Parliament. That was one of the ways of keeping the poor man down, is saying, well, if you're going to be a member of Parliament, you must own property, you must own land. And they actually came up with some crazy schemes to try to get small amounts of land to workers. Those never quite worked out. But they thought, what if we ultimately just get rid of the property requirement? Let any person, because in these new cities, you might be doing well for yourself, but you don't own land. You don't own a house. So you would not qualify for Parliament, even though you own and operate a large workshop or even a factory. The Chartism will be kind of the first large-scale working-class movement. Sometimes they went in a violent way. Sometimes they were more peaceful. A lot of their leaders ended up in jail frequently. They achieved almost nothing while they were there, but most of their proposals will eventually become law. They kind of set an agenda for what the future should hold, of what workers wanted. That these are the kind of things that workers want. And especially that universal manhood suffrage thing, that changes to the electoral process were very, very important to the working class, starting with the Chartists. So remember that about them. They kind of set in this dream amongst workers that universal manhood suffrage is something that could happen. And it needs to happen because they are the workers and hear us roar. All right, the next ism, after Chartism and nationalism. We'll talk more about this later, but I want to introduce this concept to you. Nationalism, of course, ideas of nation have been around for some time as nation states developed in the late medieval time period. And you went from, instead of a medieval kind of monarchy, to actual nation states, like the birth of modern France with Joan of Arc. But more of a scientific nationalism influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment are going to be born out of the Enlightenment, but also born out of Napoleon humiliating everybody. Humiliating the Germans, the Prussians, and the Austrians, humiliating the Spanish, humiliating the Italians, and them feeling as though we should fight back because we're Germans, because we're Italians, and because we're Spanish, and we should rule ourselves. We shouldn't have a foreigner coming in to rule us. And second, coming out of Romanticism and ideals of the Romantics looked back to the past and romanticized, in a way, the past. And that past should influence how you perceived what your nation is. So kind of their basic ideas were, first, that each people group, or today we might call it an ethnic group, has its own unique characteristics and a common culture. And part of that common culture are things like shared language, shared history, and shared territory. Those are kind of the big three, that they came from a place, they have a history, and their language is similar. Which is a new and kind of unique way of looking at nationalism and looking at what a nation is. Some leaders of nations liked this because they had a pretty homogenous nation where all the people were kind of the same ethnic group. But this becomes a problem when you think about countries like Austria, which were several large groups and then dozens of smaller groups who all kind of wanted their own. If you wake up this idea, you deserve your own nation, you are a people, and you're being ruled by a different people, then that can lead to the downfall of your empire. So the last basic idea is this idea you should have your own nation because that nation will preserve itself. And you'll see the rise of Zionism, of this desire of Jews to say, well, maybe we need our own nation because who else is going to protect us? Because if we're part of a German nation and we're not Germans, what will happen? If we're part of the French nation and we're not French, and they see, and the French start defining French as part of the shared territory, history, culture, then maybe they don't belong. The interesting thing is it's not a deeply unified movement. It doesn't have a lot of leading theorists. A lot of countries have leading theorists, like there's leading German nationalists and Russian nationalists. But it's a movement that's employed by both conservatives and liberals, which is kind of why I put this picture in the top right of a conservative and a liberal who are both known as ardent nationalists. Because nationalism can be used by both. A lot of nationalists didn't like other groups of nationalists. Sometimes conservatives tried to use nationalism to advance their agenda, and sometimes they tried to squash nationalism. It kind of depended upon the local environment. So again, if you're Austrian and conservative, you hate nationalism. You want to crush it. You never want to see it because nationalism will destroy you. All right, on to everybody's favorite ism, socialism. And the old question, has true socialism ever really been tried? And here are a list of many different attempts at socialism from the Soviet Union, North Korea, National Socialists, also known as the Nazis. Jesus, I don't know how many times I've heard, well, Jesus and his followers in the early church, they were all socialists. The Shakers, Oneida Community, we talked about them last year. Almost every cult is some type of socialist. Sports, where you don't keep score. I've heard that called socialist because, competition's bad. We should all cooperate. And, of course, hippie communes, where there's a lot of effort to have communal property unless it comes down to your stash. So this is a topic I want to talk about in class and kind of debate. I will talk about a couple of these, like the whole issue of Jesus. There are elements of communal ownership of property in the early church. The difference between that and, say, Marxist socialism is Marxist socialism was a revolutionary movement And if you didn't agree with it, they're going to put you against the wall and kill you. In the early church, it was all voluntary. And generally what we see in socialist utopias where there's an attempt to create socialism, the only time it ever really works, because I think true socialism has been tried and it has worked. The Shakers figured it out. They're like, hey, we're not going to have private property and we're all going to work really hard. They just died out because they didn't believe in getting married and having children. So that didn't work. The Oneida community, they made all kinds of money giving up all their property and then working communally together. So, but that's, again, they volunteered to do that. Most cults are highly successful and oftentimes make immense amount of money. But again, people are volunteering to be in those. When you look at the ones higher up on the list, those are ones where there were mass killings of people who opposed them, mass re-educations of those who opposed them, and ultimately either they collapsed or they had to make serious changes to how they did socialism to move forward. Sports where you don't keep score, that probably will never succeed. All right. On to the origins of socialism. Where did it come from? Here's something to think. If you're thinking about voting Bernie Sanders, remember that socialism started in France. Kind of history's biggest losers. So is that the ism you want to follow? Maybe it is. Well, where did this come from? Why were the French suddenly coming up with this idea of, hey, maybe we need to work together instead of competing against each other? Well, it goes along with the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. People, they admired, hey, there's this, you can't but admire the new prosperity that comes out of this, the material prosperity that comes out of the Industrial Revolution, the productivity that comes out of the Industrial Revolution. So that productivity and progress, there's clear material progress being made by the Industrial Revolution. However, it was changing the way people interacted. We talked about this last time. Before, a family worked at home. They worked with their family. The family was the unit of production. An individual had a lot of interesting freedoms in their own economic sphere. But now you have industry taking away those personal connections, and now you're going to work for a factory where the owner probably doesn't live anywhere even near the factory, and the owner will never know who you are. And you are just a replaceable cog, and you lose control over the means of production. And laissez-faire economics itself, they felt, was dangerous to society because it broke down the idea that we're all in this together and instead put us against each other. Just like in college admissions. There's only so many kids who get into UGA or Georgia Southern University. And, okay, everyone gets into Georgia Southern. So there's a limit. But it's all competition. It's competition based upon grades and who can hire someone to write the best essay for them. That all of that is bad. What if we cooperated? Maybe we need to go back to that. They were concerned also about low wages. That people were making a lot of money in factories if you were the owner, but people who were the workers weren't making that money. So why was the profit not being distributed to those workers? And that misdistribution of income was deeply concerning to them. The income coming into the factories, 99% of it's going to the owner and 1% is going to the workers. And they were also really concerned about mismanagement. They felt like science could make this all better, that industrialization could be even better if we brought in science to make it perfect. And kind of the biggest one, the reason it's called socialism, is this belief that the communal spirit, the spirit of that small late medieval town of 200 people, was breaking down into selfish individualism. Every man for himself. That the idea that two people are competing for the same job means that one's going to win, one's going to lose. That two factories are competing against each other, that means one's going to win and one's going to lose. What if we can cooperate? What if we can put more of a focus on society and social groups? Finally, early French socialists wanted a more scientifically or rationally organized economy, and for that, government would be the key. That they had to, so again, the socialism comes right out of the Enlightenment. It is in many ways an Enlightenment idea to scientifically study the economy and figure out how to make the economy run best. Karl Marx saw himself as a scientist, not as a politician, because he saw himself as building off of the works of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution. All right, utopian socialism is kind of the ideal of creating. It's kind of the early socialists of creating small little utopians like the Oneida Community. Here's John Humphrey Noyes, who got arrested for preaching free love because he believed, hey, you can't even own your spouse. You shouldn't own somebody else like that. You can be with whoever you wish. So they oftentimes criticize traditional structures like marriage, and many of the early socialists were like, just get rid of marriage completely because it's a form of property ownership. You're owning a spouse. They wanted these small, ideal communities, usually a few hundred to a few thousand, and they were deeply suspicious of capitalism and private property because capitalism was about you ruling everything, and private property meant you were trying to get something as opposed to sharing it with someone else. And why should your spouse be your private property? Kind of the founder of this early socialism was our friend Henri de Saint-Simon. He was French. This drawing of him shows him with a large nose. I've seen others with an even larger nose. Late in life, he was not well known during his life. Late in life, he did attempt to kill himself by shooting himself in the head 6 times, and he failed. And if there's no greater metaphor for socialism than this, I don't know what is. That socialism oftentimes in history has been deeply self-destructive and ultimately failing. He was a huge supporter of the American and French Revolution. In fact, when he went to America to fight on the American side in the American Revolution, he felt like America has it going on, that there's no hierarchy, there's no aristocracy, there's no nobility, there's a lot of social mobility, economic mobility. So he felt what they needed was rational management, getting scientists to run things instead of what he called parasites. That parasites were those who were usually the church officials, wealthy aristocrats who did nothing but drew paychecks and drew big paychecks. And he wanted those replaced by doers, and the doers were scientists, those trained to run government. Biggest of all, he wanted to help the poor, that all of this should go to help the poor. So while these ideas were not adopted during his life, many will come after him, discover his writings, and start adding on to and creating new versions of socialism. All right, Robert Owen was a Welsh industrialist. He was a self-made man. He made all kinds of money off of cotton manufacturing. He bought some mills, made a bunch of money, and then he bought another mill at New Lanark in Scotland, and he went there and he was distraught to see how the workers lived. He was a big believer in John Locke, his idea of the blank slate, and he felt like if these workers are living like this, what is society going to make out of them? They're going to become bad people. What if I can make this industrial system into a more humane environment? I'll have better humans. That these people will turn out better if society can write on their blank slate in a better way. So he creates New Lanark. He kind of recreated New Lanark in, first of all, better quarters. That they were going to live in clean, well-lit quarters. This photograph is kind of the restoration of New Lanark today. It's a historical place. You can go visit it. Free recreational facilities. Education was key for him. He provided free education from the time they were very small for the workers' children, rewards for good work. And what's interesting is in all of these things he was providing, he turned a profit, which made him a magnet from people all over the world to come and see what was he doing, treating his workers well, but still turning a profit. And so people wanted to emulate that. They thought maybe this is a new way to do industrialization. He eventually sold New Lanark, went to Indiana, tried a new one called New Harmony, and utterly failed. And most people were not able to replicate what he had done because they were not able to turn that profit. So his big idea ultimately will not be widely adopted because profit is more important to capitalists than people. Finally, Charles Fourier, an interesting fellow. He also was a socialist utopian. He wanted a utopia based upon specific principles, including exactly 1,620 people living on about 5,000 acres of land. Most of it would be farming with just a little bit of industry. There'd be a rotation in jobs to avoid boredom. There would even be more money for jobs that people wouldn't want. So there was some degree of private property and pay for important work. What he's more remembered for is the total emancipation of women. He was, according to some people, the father of feminism. And apparently he was the first one to use the term feminism. That marriage should be done away with, and all forms of free love, not just between a man and a woman, that we should affirm one's difference. And so you're kind of seeing this for the first time in Western civilization, this idea that alternative forms of sexuality should be accepted. And that women must be liberated. And the first thing is getting rid of marriage. That women should be free to be individuals and stand on their own merits and their own talents, and should be rewarded for those merits and talents, and should be open to do whatever they are. He never actually tried creating one of these phalanxes, although many people did. They took his ideas. There were a bunch of them tried in America. There were some tried in Europe. They all failed. On his dark side, he was deeply anti-Semitic. Granted, a lot of leading Enlightenment thinkers were. And he does talk about, in the socialist utopia of the future, that eventually the seas would lose their salinity and turn into lemonade. I think he was speaking metaphorically, but it's a weird quote. So that is kind of the foundations of socialism. In our next lesson, we're going to get to anarchism. That's a lot of fun. And the king of all socialists, Karl Marx himself. So I'll see you next time.